Is the loss of traditional values causing marriage rates to decline? I'm happily married, but have friends who aren't. They feel like a major reason why dating and marriage rates are dropping is because we are losing traditional values, and they say it's making the dating scene especially tough for men. Summing up their argument, back in the day, commitment, family, and long-term relationships were highly valued, creating a more stable and predictable dating environment. Nowadays, with the decline of these values, the dating pool has become more chaotic and superficial. There is a cultural push for instant gratification and personal freedom over commitment, making it harder for men to find serious, long-term partners. Social media and dating applications have only made things worse, turning dating into a game of swipes and likes rather than meaningful connections. They showed me a YouTube video where a guy is dating artificial intelligence girls on sites like Character AI and Louvre AI. That's crazy. The focus on individualism and the constant search for the next best thing has created a dating culture that's increasingly difficult for men who are looking for real, lasting relationships. Do you agree with them? Or do you think there's another reason at fault? Or do you think they're crazy? Story 1. In English-speaking Western countries, the gap between what men and women want and expect from each other is the widest it has ever been. It's not just marriage declining. It's also the number of relationships and the amount of sex. Everything. Story 2. I agree with the cost of living being a reason, but the loneliness epidemic may also be contributing to it. Financially, they have to earn enough to support their lifestyle, but they also have to be able to socialize and have enough free time and a good place to meet people. If I wanted to avoid talking to someone, it's easier than ever, and if I wanted to meet someone at a third place, it's harder than ever. I think the personal values that someone holds can definitely affect whether or not that person marries, but I believe macro influences have a bigger impact on population-wide effects like lowering marriage rates. Story 3. Well, if you go to any of the relationship subreddits, more than 90% of the people posting just never grew up. Poor communication skills, ignorance of major incompatibilities, and absence of responsibilities are the key causes I see on a day-to-day basis. Story 4. It's quite simple. Humans react to incentives. What is so interesting and rewarding about marriage nowadays? What about it is worth the process of trying to date? What about it is worth the risk of divorce? Maybe it's just me being born in a 1 in a million case of a perfect marriage like my parents that messed up my expectations, but simply trying to date killed any hope of meeting someone nice for me, and any faith in marriage died alongside it. Marriage for me is just as alive as vinyl records or flip phones. Story 5. I have no data to back this up, but speaking as a British person who has all of the following things, but is not blind to the difficulties of the generations below me, the following things are very expensive. Weddings, buying a house, kids. Nobody has any money, and of those 3 expensive things, I know which I would firmly put as the least important thing to spend money on. Story 6. As a married Generation X man, I would suggest there are many reasons for this. But briefly, one that I'm confident is a big driver in Australia, where I am, is that until the 1980s and 1990s, women were broadly dependent on their husband's ability to earn an income. A single woman didn't have much of a future in this country. There have always been outliers, of course, but this is broadly true. The women of my generation have built on the work of the feminists of the 1970s and 1980s, and since that time, more and more women have had the choice of career or children, and for a minority of women, the opportunity to have both. This has meant that women no longer find themselves in a position where they have to marry to have a decent life. Instead, they marry if it's something they want to do. And more power to them, I say. Since this is Ask Men, I'll add that men being more able to make the choice to marry or not is also a good thing. There are many men who are happier being unmarried too. Story 7. There's a lot to take into account here. Societal pressure to get married was much stronger 50 to 70 years ago than it is today, thankfully. Greater opportunities for a different life exist now for women than they did 50 to 70 years ago. To put it into perspective, in the United States, women couldn't get bank accounts on their own until the mid-1970s. For women, especially, marriage was the quickest way to a better life. The system wasn't in place for women to thrive or exist without men being gatekeepers. This is why I hate when people glorify better times without acknowledging the subjugation that accompanied them. The cost of divorce is devastating. So much so, many of the people not divorcing who want to have chosen to remain together due to the costliness of divorce and possible separation from children. At a 40 to 50% rate, it's understandably a chance not worth taking. We have more information now than we did even 30 years ago. People are wisely looking at the actions and mistakes of others before making moves themselves. Before, younger people were told to marry with very little opposition. Now, they can see examples of what happens if it goes wrong and the regret so many have. Let's not romanticize versions of back in the day. Cheating and second families were a thing back in the day. They just kept quiet about the bad and were very loud about the good. The older generations just didn't have the technology to expose themselves like we do now, and they pretended like things didn't happen. Story 8. I'm sure there are many other factors, including the one the original poster mentioned. But I think the main culprit is the rising cost of living. Especially here in Asia, married couples are expected to raise a family together, which means having children, and that leads to having extra expenses and less time and energy to make money due to the added responsibility of childcare. A lot of young people just don't see the benefit of married life as opposed to casual dating once they weigh the economic costs. Story 9. Housing costs. To raise a family, you need two things: lots of food and a secure shelter. Food costs have mostly been addressed, thanks modern agriculture. But the cost of having a place to raise them has become exorbitant in many places. Sure, you could raise a family of 4 in a mini mansion in Omaha, but your employer is in San Francisco and insists that you be in the office half-time for morale. If you are pretty sure you will never be able to afford more than a one-bedroom apartment, there is not much motivation to settle down and start a family, and thus much less incentive to get married. It is basic supply and demand, but we do not want to admit that, so we make up excuses about culture and psychology. Story 10. There is an increasing number of people who view marriage as just a piece of paper that isn't needed to show love, along with increasing divorce rates and the inability to afford a home or residence because of housing prices. Story 11. Social changes. Two social changes, principally: the decline of religion and the liberalizing of attitudes towards women's roles in the world. Both these mean it's more acceptable to remain unmarried and more acceptable to marry later. As a result, the overall marriage rate has decreased. Essentially, there's much less pressure, especially on women, to get married. It's now much more something people do because they want to rather than because they have to. Story 12. As usual, it's a bunch of different things. The cost of living has increased significantly, so everyone's just out there trying to survive. Quality of life is vastly improved in the modern era. You'd think this would be a plus for marriages, but it's actually counterintuitive. People are focused more and more on finding their own happiness. Despite the increases in the cost of living, there are more options than ever for people to pursue, and they're less focused on grouping together in families for monetary or survival purposes. As you've said, the dating pool is problematic. Online dating has made people drastically lazier in their search for love, with less and less effort needed to be put in. The loss of values and moral fiber is a very puritanical or conservative way of looking at it. The fact is, it's just a different time. People have different styles of communicating now, and as always, it works for some but not for others. The advancement of technology has only exacerbated that change. I don't think it's necessarily a moral issue. It's just that society is a little more complex than simply, my group is the in-group and theirs is the out-group. Story 13. Cost of living 100%. Young adults can't afford to buy a home. Why would they spend a significant proportion of their savings on a wedding? In addition, it's no longer seen as taboo to have a permanent partner you're not married to. 40 years ago, this would have seemed strange to most people. Now it's acceptable to simply have a lifelong partner without legally declaring it through marriage. Story 14. Is the loss of traditional values causing marriage rates to decline? Yes, and it's not a bad thing. I hope the trend continues until the only marriages left are those in which both participants actually want it, instead of feeling forced into it by societal pressure that stems from traditional values. Story 15. If there is a disparity between your income and hers, you run a very high risk with little to no reward. I owned my house before I got married. After marriage, I paid all the bills, mortgage, utilities, etc. I saved money and invested it. In contrast, she squandered every penny she made, racked up credit card debt, and contributed little to nothing. When she initiated a divorce, she was entitled to 50% of everything, as well as alimony and a portion of my pension. I was entitled to 50% of her debt. If you are not having children, marriage is far too risky, especially if one party benefits greatly from divorce. Story 16. Marriage is simply a tradition. There is no need to get married when you love the person or when you want to raise a child. In terms of why rates are declining, it's money. Marriage requires you to buy an engagement ring and then pay for an entire wedding venue. Story 17. Diminishing social skills in a population relying on online interactions for everything from shopping and swiping to conversation, like right now, impacts marriage numbers. This is reinforced by an increasing number of patients reporting social anxiety and requiring prescription drugs. Another negatively impacting aspect of online platforms is the manner in which they become popular, sensationalism and skewed, divisive information. These two sprawling subjects greatly decrease the overall ability of people to create healthy, valued networks of relationships, and even more so, marriages. Story 18. The dating landscape has definitely changed with technology. The instant gratification culture from applications and social media can make forming deep connections more challenging. However, some people find meaningful relationships through these platforms, even if it is more complicated. Story 19. I would start with why we want people to get married. What are the goals? Why do we want people married? The marriage rate is dropping. Well, we used to force people to get married. We forced them to marry abusive people they weren't attracted to. We told generations of people that their whole purpose of being alive was to make children for the church. With fewer people being married, what problem are you trying to solve? It sounds like you want finding someone you love to be possibly married to, and you want it to be easy. Unless you use God or commerce to force a marriage, marriage is not easy. Story 20. Traditional values. What are those? Do you go to church every Sunday? Do you help and participate in your local community? Does your wife stay home? And can you maintain your budget while having 5 kids? Can you and those 6 other people go on a family trip for 2 weeks every summer? No? Then maybe your definition of traditional values really just means keep the wife pregnant and cooking. You need to be careful. A lot of anti-rights people love using traditional values as code for oppressing women and people of color. Story 21. The same reason we don't send faxes anymore. Email was invented. Fax is to email as marriage is to it being socially acceptable to just have a partner, I suppose. No piece of paper required. Story 22. Being married has financial benefits. If anything, a higher cost of living should be an incentive for people to get married. Having kids would be more affected by higher cost of living. I'd say men are choosing not to pursue it because they think it's not worth it anymore or that it's too risky. Also, the American dream of a white picket fence has pretty much died, and more men and women are still behaving like they are in their early 20s all the way up to around 35. So, mostly political, social, and cultural reasons. Story 23. Large swaths of people are abandoning religion, and the benefit of marriage isn't particularly apparent beyond religious dogma. Additionally, there are just fewer reasons to be married. You don't have to do it to have kids. You don't have to do it to take care of yourself as a woman. You don't need kids to run your farm in most places in the United States. Marriage essentially just gives you the ability to file jointly, but I don't even think that is completely blocked behind marriage after rules about long partnerships gave similar benefits. Story 24. I won't marry because it's a huge risk. Among all the divorced men, I know there's not a single one who didn't get the short end of the stick. So why marry? I don't have to be married to be in a relationship. I don't have to be married to love a woman. So why get the state involved? Story 25. Marriage is not as important to people anymore. That's it. There's no value judgment on that. Marriage is a thing you can do. You can also not do it. Nobody should get invested in other people's business about whether they marry or not, and also let them marry if they want to. Story 26. More people are realizing it is typically smarter to wait to get married. My partner and I have been together for over a decade now. Why would we have needed to get married already? Story 27. Watching half a dozen of your male friends go through nasty divorces that put them on the brink of bankruptcy. The men I know, myself included, do not see any value in getting a state contract to profess our love for a woman. There is far too much financial downside, and the benefits are negligible. The family courts have destroyed marriage. Story 28. I think that's a load of nonsense. Speaking as a man, I think the biggest change is that men no longer have the stranglehold over women in society that they once had, and women are learning not to settle for men who can't even pull their own weight in the household. Men used to be able to dangle marriage in front of women's faces, and that was the only thing women had, so they would put up with men who were abusive, unemotional, lazy, out of shape, and so on. Due to societal norms, men also made more money doing the same or less work, so marriage was a way for women to obtain financial security. And before online dating and globalization, women had fewer options and had a harder time seeing what else was out there. I think most women still want to be married, but they are no longer settling for inadequate men because there is less pressure or need for them to do so. I don't know if there has been an overcorrection, namely that all the women are interested in the same 25% of men. I just know that when I encounter a single man above the age of 30, there's a pretty obvious reason he's still single in nearly every case. I'm not discounting that sometimes it's because it's his choice. Story 29. I'm a left-leaning married person with children. I think traditional values are losing their importance, and that's not a terrible thing in my opinion. Women don't naturally enjoy raising children in the traditional way, having dinner ready for their husband, and dealing with a lot of domestic responsibilities. Especially if the breadwinner husband feels entitled to the whole domestic bliss, relaxing with a cigar while the perfect children are well-behaved and seen but not heard. Often, the husband who wants this arrangement doesn't truly provide enough to make this lifestyle worthwhile, and in my experience, I see these men either intentionally or accidentally giving their wife an allowance or feeling that she's not fully entitled to his money. That's terrible in so many ways. A woman having a job gives her options, as she doesn't necessarily need to stay in the marriage, so she may decide to marry later when her career has taken off or not at all. So, the working husband must be held to a higher standard by contributing financially and also helping to clean the house, make dinner, etc. This is becoming more common than the traditional housewife arrangement, and that obviously makes the dynamic different now. My wife earns well, and I more or less stay with the children. It's challenging in many ways, and having a clean house and an amazing dinner ready when you get home from work is possible, but certainly not consistently possible. I feel for the wives of the past. I think now women are entering long-term relationships with both eyes open, and that's good for them. I have a strong marriage and want the same for others. What I will say is take a hard look at your grandmothers or great-grandmothers. Do you think they really liked the arrangement if they were housewives? Sure, some women want a traditional lifestyle and more power to them, but they are fewer and fewer, and that's making the marriage rate go down.